So here we are with yet another emulator handheld. This one is called the TRIMUI Smart Pro, and truth be told, I should have had a video ready about this weeks ago, but I've just been having too much fun playing on it. Okay, so when I finally got my hands on a Miyoo Mini and made a video about it, I was lamenting the fact that I was having to buy, well, I wasn't having to, but I was buying all of these handheld consoles, and it was getting a bit expensive, and it was becoming a bit difficult to keep up with all the new releases that are coming out all the time. And whenever there's something different, it does catch my eye, but I do have to pick and choose quite carefully what I get. Well, in response to that, LITNXT got in touch with me and said they were interested in sending me this thing here, which is the TRIMUI Smart Pro. Now, this has been around for a little while now. This is a slightly updated version of the console, but again, this has still been out for a little while. I got it in this DMG colorway, and I think it looks really nice. I'm not normally a big fan of horizontal kind of form factor handhelds. I normally like the portrait style, like the original Game Boy style, but honestly, I have been playing on this loads. Now, the thing that LITNXT asked me to comment on in particular is what I thought of the bundled operating system. So it came with an SD card, which contained a load of games and all the other stuff, but it was using an operating system called CrossMix-OS. Now, the interesting thing about CrossMix is that it's not a custom firmware as such. It's not a whole custom operating system like Onion OS on the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus. What it is like a customized version of the stock firmware. Now, the stock firmware on this thing is pretty good anyway, but honestly, CrossMix for me, the thing that makes this really stand out is how it just saves on so much hassle. It kind of is much easier, much more intuitive to use than a lot of other operating systems I've tried. Now, there are some other ones like MuOS on the Anbernic SP, or as I mentioned, Onion OS, that are really good, that absolutely transform some of these consoles. But a lot of them do require quite a lot of work and quite a lot of knowledge in terms of setting them up, in terms of overlay filters, in terms of just the right settings to get your displays right and so on. They do require a decent amount of understanding, at the very least, following along to something like a retro game core video where you can see how you're supposed to set all these things up. And it takes quite a bit of time to do. With this, I found it super easy. And when you set up certain settings for your displays and things like that, you can actually just do it universally and it applies it across all of your consoles. I've given it to friends to try, and in most cases, apart from going ooh at the LEDs around these joysticks here, it's been commented on that it is quite straightforward to use. The menu's very intuitive. It's easy to find your way in, find your way back, and to you know, mess about with the settings if you wanted to. But generally, the whole thing is set up and looking very slick. It runs great. And in this video, I'm just going to be talking you through my experiences with it. But as I say, it's taken me a little while to make the video, not so much in terms of filming, but just because I wanted to keep playing on it. I was surprised. It's very comfortable. It's easy to hold, and hours passed by. I've played right through, completed some games on it. So really, I should have got a wriggle on and started making a video, but I think it's testament to what a pleasant surprise this console has been, in that I have been playing on it so much. Anyway, let's get into the review. So as I said, this has been sent to me by LITNXT. They also sent me this nice little carry case here. It's kind of a squishy hard case that protects the console. It's nice and soft inside, and it's got a nice easy zip that goes around it. I've been using this quite a lot to protect it when it's in transit. It's got a nice little mesh pocket inside for putting your spare SD cards, USB cables and things like that. Maybe a polishing cloth, because the screen does need a little bit of wiping every now and then to get your fingerprints off. And you've got like an elastic strip across the front to stop the console falling out. It's a great little case. Now, as I say, I was sent this console by LITNXT, and for that, I am very grateful. As I said, it was becoming expensive trying to get my hands on as many of these handhelds as I could, and I was accumulating quite a collection and spending quite a bit of money. Now, I've not been paid. I'm not advertising what they're selling. They just sent it to me because they wanted my opinion on what I thought of this that they were selling. They sell the console on their website. They also sell the SD cards with the operating system, the CrossMix-OS, loaded up on there. I have got an affiliate link. It is in the description, so if you're interested in checking these out, go and take a look. So I'm new to the Smart Pro, but it did remind me very much of the form factor of the PlayStation Vita, from the D-pad and the face buttons up at the top with the joysticks down towards the bottom, and then the layout of the start and select and the menu buttons and the volume and the power button, the shoulder buttons. Everything is in a very similar place with very similar proportions to the PlayStation Vita, which is no bad thing. I love the PlayStation Vita, and maybe that's why this has felt so comfortable playing for extended periods of time. As I say, I do like the portrait orientation kind of consoles, but yeah, I do love the Vita, so this reminds me of that kind of playing experience. Also maybe a little bit like using a Switch Lite as well. So if you're a fan of either of those consoles, this feels very similar. You'll be right at home using it. Now the D-pad is quite small. It's got the TRIMUI logo on it, which I thought would be a bit uncomfortable, but it's good for keeping your thumb centered. It's a small D-pad and it works reasonably well depending on the game. It is a little bit sharp on the edges, but nothing problematic. Below the D-pad is the left stick with an RGB LED ring around it that lights up when it's in use. The branding with the 3 hexagons is nicely used across the design, and it's also featured on the home button on the bottom left. There's stereo speaker openings just below the main screen. The sound from that is pretty good. It feels well placed and it's never obscured by your fingers, so it doesn't muffle any of the sound. Over on the right you'll find the start, select and right stick, also with an LED ring around it, and then the face buttons, in this case in the classic Game Boy wine red colour, and on the rest of the shell in a light grey. It works well and it looks really nice in the flesh. At the top there's a bumper and a trigger on each side. Both of them are buttons. There's no kind of analog gradual input, and there's also a volume adjustment button which can affect the brightness if you're holding the start button as well. The power button on the left and the host USB on the top center, which I quite like because a lot of the time you get 2 USB-C sockets next to one another and it's difficult to work out which is the right one to plug in when you're charging. So having one at the top and one at the bottom is quite good. The one at the top is for connecting things like external controllers, and at the bottom is for charging and powering it. So I found that really, really easy if you're fumbling about just getting a cable to plug in and put it on charge. Now, one nice thing about the USB-C port at the bottom, when you plug it into charge, the 3 little dots of the TRIMUI logo light up with the corresponding colours of where it's up to in terms of if it's charging, if it's low on power, or if it's fully charged, which I think is a really nice touch. There's also an internal microphone, a headphone socket, and a function switch that we'll look at in a little bit. The SD card that was supplied with the console and contains the CrossMix-OS ready to install is a branded SanDisk card. Now this is a welcome change from the cheap, unbranded, slightly prone to randomly corrupting and losing all of your data that you often get with these sorts of consoles. Tapping the power button to wake it up. The console, in this case, it's waking up from sleep mode. I've been using that a lot because it feels like it drains the battery very, very little, and it's very, very quick to get back into your games when you want to start playing again. So you'll see that as well as the screen coming on, the lights around the joysticks also come on. Now I did think that having those LED rings around the joysticks would be not only a bit of a gimmick, but also a bit of a distraction. When I first started modding Nintendo Game Boys, I used to try changing the colour of the power LED next to the screen, and a lot of the time it'd end up giving me a bit of a headache because it'd be distracting my focus when I'm trying to look at the screen. So I'm always wary of having other lights around the screen area, but in this case, not only does it have no distraction at all, I thought it might look a bit tacky, but in hand it looks lovely, and everyone who I've given it to try out, it's the first thing that they've commented on. So it does have quite a nice look to it with those. So as I switch on, I can continue from exactly where I was last up to. In this case, I was playing Keynote, or at least I think that's how you pronounce it, on the Sega Mega Drive emulator. So this is a shoot 'em up that allows use of either the stick or the D-pad for directional control. And although normally I default to a D-pad with these kind of games, I've been favouring the joystick more and more. It actually feels a lot more comfortable to use. It's well placed on the front of the console, and the games tend to feel more under control rather than using the D-pad. Now the screen does pick up marks and fingerprints easily. I've recently received a ceramic cleaning kit from PowerUp containing a variety of cleaning cloths and a nano ceramic liquid that when applied to the surface provides an oleophobic coating. That means it doesn't like oil, so it's quite easy to wipe down once it's got that coating on. I'm going to be trying that out soon, but it does require 24 to 48 hours once applied, and I wanted to do more play testing, so I didn't have time to just leave it sat there for 2 days, but I will be letting you know about that a little bit more in future. Anyway, in this case, I just cleaned up the screen with my trusty glassed cleaning cloth, and it came up fine. Now, this screen does seem to grab the fingerprints a little bit more readily than some of these other consoles I've used, so it is worth having the trusty glasses cleaning cloth handy, and you can keep it in that mesh pocket in the carry case. So if I power it back on and select exit game, this takes me back to the menu, and this interface is the main reason I was curious to try out the Smart Pro. So it's called CrossMix-OS, and rather than it being a custom firmware like Onion OS for the Mio Mini or MuOS for the Anbernic SP, this is a modified version of the standard TRIMUI interface, and I have to say it's really really good. It looks good, it's intuitive, it's easy to navigate, and more importantly, it's easy to adjust the settings across all the emulators without messing things up and without getting lost in all the menus. I am terrible for going into the menus, and it feels like the more things I tweak and change, the worse it gets, and trying to get back to where it was, I often find quite difficult. That is often one of the things I find most frustrating about working with RetroArch. It's got so many settings, it can just become overwhelming. And for someone like me who doesn't really know what I'm doing, I'm just trying out different things, sometimes I can get it to a point where it just doesn't look or sound even as good as it did out of the box. But with CrossMix-OS, it's really straightforward to make the changes, see how they look, and more importantly, change them back if you don't like them. This is something I have struggled with in the past, and I've got lots of these consoles. I imagine someone new to these handhelds would find it really difficult to bring their console to a setup that meets their needs, and in most cases, people are going to stick with the subpar default settings. Conversely, this has been fantastic right from when I first loaded it up. As you scroll through the game list, there's a background image themed with the selected console, and to the right is the game logo, a screenshot, and cover art for each game as it's selected. Pressing B to exit the game list, and the wide selection of platforms is there to choose from. Each time you move to a different platform, the background changes, which I really like. Most of the ones that I've tried have worked really well. Some of the more demanding or later platforms have a smaller number of games and tend to struggle a little bit to run those, and that wasn't a particular surprise to me based on my experience with similar handhelds of this nature. So when it does struggle, that's usually down to the frame rate, and as that stutters, the audio stutters, and the audio stuttering is always a dead giveaway that the handheld is struggling to run certain games, and I find that too distracting to be able to play. The games are technically playable, but I want it to feel quite smooth and slick, and to be honest, I'd rather just boot up an old favourite and have everything work properly. But it is good to have the option there, and I think probably if you dig into the menus a little bit more and start to optimise everything for performance, you might get them running a little bit better. But my main emphasis on this review is just how good this operating system is to just switch on and use from the off without having to do too much excessive tweaking. So usually the games seem okay visually, but the slight stuttering on the audio gives it away. As with most of these handhelds, you're pretty much okay with everything that came out up to and including Sony PlayStation. So the form factor suggested it might be quite good fun for emulating PSP, but when I tried loading up God of War Chains of Olympus, it was somewhat struggling. So in the case of PSP games, I'm going to stick to my original PSP console or indeed my PlayStation Vita. So sound-wise, it's pretty good. I've not even had to use headphones yet because I am perfectly happy with the stereo speakers that are built into the console. One of the great things about CrossMix-OS that it is pretty much all set up for you right out of the box, and there's not the usual tinkering required for me to get the overlays and the settings looking good. All the stuff in this video is pretty much using the defaults aside from maybe disabling the custom borders. Neo Geo Pocket Color looked great and played well. Tried out a little bit of magical drop on there, which can get a bit frantic. Everything ran absolutely perfectly and looked gorgeous on the screen. Playing a little bit of Game Boy Tetris, the screen looked great, but the sound effects sounded slightly off. So even though it played well, what I tend to try and do when I am testing these things out is I will play games that I am very familiar with. I will notice if something is slightly off, and I don't know what it was. The sound effects maybe sounded a little slower, maybe not quite as snappy or punchy as usual. After playing for a few minutes, you kind of don't notice it anymore anyway, and I think if you're not like me and you don't spend most of your time playing games as just playing Tetris on an original Game Boy, then you won't notice those subtle differences. Gameplay wise though, it was very good. None of the issues that I suffered when I was testing it out on the Analog Pocket, for instance, so that's definitely a thumbs up from me. I have actually been playing Tetris DX much more than the original Tetris for the Game Boy. That's the Game Boy Color version. It's a great game. It is much quicker. It does again get quite a bit more frantic, and again this looked and sounded fantastic on this little handheld. You do have slight borders down the side. I mean, you can have the option to stretch the display right across the screen, but yeah, who's going to want that? Although having said that, the option I go for, which is kind of maximizing the aspect ratio to make the best use of the screen, some people had turned their nose up at that because you get the option to have the pixel perfect display, which is slightly smaller but is much more accurate in terms of its representation of the original screen. The advantage of this console is that depending on your tastes, you can set it to any of those really easily. So when you dip into a game list, it remembers where you were up to on that list last time, and if you load a game you've played before, it automatically resumes from wherever you were up to the last time you played. Now this can be disabled in the options, and it's quite easy to find, so if you'd rather it loaded up from the beginning each time, you can set it to do that quite easily. So at the top of the screen, when you're in the menus, you can scroll through different sub-menus, including one called Best, which has got a variety of pre-packed collections of games to choose from. My favourite of these is a set of vertical shoot-'em-ups. I love a scrolling shooter. I'm terrible at them, but there's something that keeps drawing me back to them. And a lot of these have the vertical tate orientation. Now with this console, the settings are already pre-configured so that when you load these games, it rotates the display and it rotates the controls. You can hold it from one end of the console vertically and play your games to your heart's content. And I have been playing them loads. I think it's a really nice way of doing it. And you know, unexpectedly, it's not as top heavy as I thought it would be. I thought it might get a little bit tiring, like the Evercade EXP that had one of those kind of features. It became very uncomfortable to play on with the controls right at the bottom and a quite top heavy machine. With this, I didn't suffer that kind of issue at all when I was playing, and I was going through game after game after game and playing for quite a significant amount of time without any real discomfort. It was a lot of fun. So some of the more modern shoot-'em-up games, like the Cave ones in particular, caused it to struggle with a lot of slowdown, but with these games there is so much going on screen. Now if you do have the console struggling to run games, it usually takes a little while longer to exit the game, but on the whole there is a great collection of these shooting games, and it was really good not having to mess around with the settings to get the controls to work and rotate the display. Now this thing is brilliant for Game Boy Advance. Loading up Drill Dozer was a good chance to try it out for rumble, which worked fine. There's not a huge amount of rumble, but it's still good and definitely noticeable. DS Emulation sadly doesn't seem to allow that same vertical orientation with one screen above the other, which would have been quite nice, at least not with the default options that you've got here, but it is easy to change position and scale of the two screens depending on what you're playing. For Dreamcast, I've tried Ikaruga and also Crazy Taxi, which ran okay, but the thumbstick felt a bit twitchy. It's like you're giving a digital input with an analog stick. I could be wrong, but it didn't feel to me like when I moved it just a little bit that there was a slight movement of the taxi, and then a little bit further it was more of a movement. It just felt kind of like playing on a D-pad, so I came out of that and went looking for something else. Now actually this kind of effect of using the stick worked really well in games like the Street Fighter Alpha series, because I was having some issues with the D-pad in terms of executing Hadoukens and things like that. So using the stick, it was much more responsive with that, which felt a bit wrong. Like I normally like using the digital input with these things, but I found the stick to be much more responsive in terms of doing those moves over and over a bit more consistently. Maybe me, but I think the D-pad, it's not that well suited to those sort of games. Now one of the things I absolutely love about this is not just the usual PlayStation, Nintendo, Sega kind of consoles, but also it's got lots of my childhood computers on there, including my first games machine, the Amstrad CPC. I have spent hours scrolling through the list of Amstrad CPC games, playing a bit of Bruce Lee, Yar Kung Fu, Escape from the Eagle's Nest. Just really took me back. And even though I thought it might be a bit tricky because a lot of these kind of games require keyboard input, I felt the emulation worked pretty well, and in most cases once you've got them loaded up it's just a case of moving around and pressing fire, so that was fine. Another one from slightly later on in my childhood is the Commodore Amiga, and Amiga emulation on it is really good. I've been playing a few games on there, things like Apedia, which is like a wasp themed shoot 'em up. It's a great game, it's so hard though. And I also played a little bit of James Pond 2 Robocod, which is a charming little platformer, bright colours, and everything was working really nicely on there too. Again, really took me back. Unfortunately, I didn't have much luck with Nintendo 64. I tried loading up Wave Race and it really struggled. Like the display was garbled, it was totally unplayable, which was a little bit disappointing. I don't know, maybe someone can let me know in the comments. Maybe there's a way of tweaking the settings to get Nintendo 64 to run a bit better. I know Wave Race often does cause emulators problems. I was trying to push it a little bit, but I'll dabble a little bit more and see which of the games are playable on there anyway. Unsurprisingly, Master System emulation is very good on there. Loaded up Alex Kidd as usual. Had a bit of fun playing with that and remembered again just how bad I am at that game. So as well as the games, there are some brilliant apps on board, including the FN key setting. Now this is a switch on the bottom and it gives you an option to use it for a number of things. I set it to switch off the LEDs on the sticks. There's also the option to set the LEDs to different settings in there, such as Ambilight, which changes depending on the display. Now we mentioned before that one of the great things about CrossMix-OS is just how easy it is to change the display settings. So here is how you do it for the overlays. You go into System Tools, then Emulators, and then Overlays. Now it comes with overlays enabled as default, which are good, especially with the Pixel Perfect displays, but I preferred maximizing the ratio and getting rid of the overlays altogether. And there's no overlays, max ratio was the setting that I went with. But the option is there depending on your preferences. And as you can see with the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance borders, they are nicely designed and well implemented, but I prefer it to have my display a little bit bigger and to not have the distractions around it. You can change the themes as well to alter the appearance of your console and your whole operating system. So whether you just fancy a change from what you've got already, or whether you just want it to look a certain way, you've got lots to choose from. PlayStation works smoothly. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 works great with no issues that I'd noticed. I pick games that I play a lot so I can notice issues quite easily, such as the DMG audio that I mentioned earlier. There is a whole selection of ports from Portmaster, which is something I've heard good things about but not really tried before. That seems to work really well. Sega CD worked great. Sonic CD looked and sounded fantastic. The SD card I got from LITNXT contained a whole range of ROMs, including ROM hacks and custom games as well. I really enjoyed playing Metroid Spooky Mission. I'd never even heard of it before. I love my Metroid games, and in this case it was kind of building up to the Halloween season, and it was just the perfect time to play that game, and I played it right through and loved every minute of it. It's a fantastic game, worth checking out if you find it. So to shut down, you press and hold the power button, and then you can select power off from the display that comes up. To switch it back on, you do a slightly long press on the button. If you want sleep mode, just tap the power button and then tap it again for wake, which is pretty quick. To be honest, even when you're powering down and booting up properly, it's pretty fast and you can get straight back into your games very quickly. So as far as these handhelds go, it is pretty well spec'd in terms of features. It's got built-in Wi-Fi and the ability to do over-the-air updates to CrossMix-OS within the apps without having to connect it to a computer. So there's an app called Moonlight, which is there to stream your gameplay, I believe. And there's also a screen record feature that you can record all of your gameplay and then upload in your videos, which, as I'm saying now, makes me realize that that is maybe a feature I could have used rather than putting a camera overhead on my console. But the video is about the console as well as the operating system. So in this case, you can see it there. But I might try that out for getting gameplay footage for my videos in future. We'll see how that goes. As a console and an operating system, as you can probably tell, I'm loving it. I'm actually loving it much more than I expected to. I have got lots of different handhelds, many of which I am very fond of. I didn't expect a new landscape orientation handheld to really start to take the crown, but I cannot stop playing on this thing. I'm really enjoying it. It's lightweight, so it's portable. The screen is pretty big. It plays a whole range of different games. We can have it in landscape or portrait orientation. It's fantastic for my favorite genre of shoot 'em up games. The operating system is very intuitive. It looks good. The controls are generally good, with the exception of maybe that D-pad that is functional. There's not issues in terms of directional inputs that I've noticed. It doesn't have those kind of issues that a lot of these other consoles have, but it's just the fact that it is quite small and not that responsive for those kind of rolling rotation kind of inputs like you get on Street Fighter. That said though, the sticks are very comfortable to use, very responsive, and I've found that I'm pretty much defaulting to those a lot of the time. I think the fact that this is the longest I have ever taken to make a video about one of these handhelds says a lot, down to the fact that I just couldn't stop playing it to actually start recording and deciding what I was going to say and so on. I just wanted to keep playing the games, and that's definitely a good sign. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to LITNXT for reaching out to me and supporting my channel by providing this for review, also providing me with the affiliate links that you'll find in the description, and also a discount code for you lucky people to get you 10% off your order across the whole website if you decide to buy anything. Huge thank you to them for supporting my channel. Big thank you also to ZedLabz, who've been supporting my channel for a long time now. I've got an affiliate link for them in the description if you wanted to get any modding gear. And other than that, I just wanted to thank you for watching. I am still trying to grow this channel. I appreciate all of your support. If you can find the time to leave a like or a comment, or even subscribe if you're not already subscribed. It does actually make quite a big difference. I don't normally make a point of banging on about liking and subscribing and all that kind of cheesy cliche because it seems to be in a lot of videos, but sometimes people will mention it in a video and think, oh, do you know what, actually I should subscribe to that channel. So here we are, it's me going, if you don't subscribe to my channel already, it'll make a massive difference. It's the easiest way you can support me other than watching my videos. I did mention earlier, I recently got my hands on this tiny little wonder, the Miu Mini. I love this thing. If you want to find out a little bit more about that, check out the video. I'll link up here. Otherwise, I will see you in my next video. Take care. Bye.